Welcome to Scholars in Spotlight. Today we have Melissa Sterry. She's returning for the second podcast in this series. We have recorded this conversation in two parts, and Melissa is a transdisciplinary design scientist and also complex system theorist. If you would listen to her first podcast, you'll notice that one of her main interests is that how to help humanity to build a better world. And in this conversation, you'll especially notice that she's been pulling strings from different disciplines to answer various different questions which I was asking. Above all, she's a lovely person to talk to and ask these kind of questions. So without further ado, let's welcome Melissa Sterry. So you are in France.
I'm in France, yes. I'm in southwest France.
Okay. I imagine, because you are a designer, I imagine your house would be like a treat to actually visit. So it might be really eccentric, kind of really weird architect's house. Am I correct? Or
No, I have my taste is it's not minimalist, but it is streamlined, as it were. But I have a lot of natural artifacts. So I have I've collected a number of specimens that relate to my work. And so I have, my family joke that it's like walking into the Natural History Museum. So yeah, there are a lot of specimens, which is mainly because, well, firstly, obviously they're useful from a scientific perspective. It's good to have the things that I am most interested in to hand, but also because sourcing of images of the various samples can actually be quite tricky. And some of the imagery that is out there, I'm not always happy with the aesthetics. So in having my own, it's obviously not quite as large as the Natural History Museum, or indeed many other collections, but I have what I need. And so yeah, there are lots of little bits of the natural world scattered around the house, and outside we're in a highly biodiverse area. And so I look out pretty much every day. I look out and I will see something interesting going on. And certainly if I take a walk and inspect we have the meadow. If I inspect the meadow, then I find all sorts of interesting bugs and flora and things going on. And I actually have a nature journal that I log down the species I find and what they're doing and so forth. So yeah, it's I walk my nature talk, as it were.
So, Melissa, last time we had a podcast in between the event, Future Cities event, if I'm correct.
That's right. Yeah.
In London, and that's a brilliant intro. If someone want to go back and listen a little bit about some of the aspects of your research and what your visions are around cities and our relationship with the environment. But what is your view on like nature in lockdown right now? How we are seeing that our relationship with the natural environment is probably maybe changing or evolving, or we are understanding it a little bit better?
It's an incredibly interesting period on many levels, because what this pandemic does is it illuminates the effectively the shortcomings, the problems within and of our current relations with the natural world. So at the most basic of levels, of course, while we know not quite what the origin of this particular virus is, and obviously there are various theories, and personally I think the probability that this came from, obviously we know it came from a wild species, but the probability that it effectively came to into our world, as it were, through the sort of processes that were actually very well portrayed in the film Contagion, and that have been discussed in various best-selling books by a number of etymologists and journalists that have studied the field. That being that effectively we're encroaching on the natural world. We are, for various reasons, be it poaching or wildlife trafficking, or logging, or simply carving roads and transport networks through virgin habitats or other. We're increasingly encroaching on the natural world, and because of that, we're coming into contact with more and more viruses. And I think that is most likely the route that this particular virus came along. But what it has highlighted is not just the problem there, but also the fact that more generally we are, we're keeping livestock, for example, in the factory farms, and we are distributing livestock. So, for example, in the wet markets, in ways that are very, very high risk to us as a species, and of course, in turn, to other species, and that these processes are reducing biodiversity, they are causing immense stress to ecological systems, and of course, they are deeply unethical. And so a big light has been shone on that. Also, of course, another really sad aspect of this development is that we have seen that deforestation is up by 65% in the Amazon so far, and that is because unscrupulous persons are taking advantage of the fact that the monitoring systems are not some aspects of those monitoring systems are not in play, i.e. the manpower on the ground that actually effectively implement the checks and the measures to try and keep deforestation down. We also today, this week, we've seen a report come out that has shown illegal raptor killings of peregrines and kites and various other species in the UK are up. And of course, we also see that poaching of rhino and the big five, amongst other species in Africa, is also up. So this has also shone a light on the fact that for all the communications, for all the data, for all the understanding within and of and beyond the scientific community, that we really have to protect biodiversity and protect species. There are they that, given half a chance, will exploit any disaster or any disruption to society. But again, juxtaposed against that, there is actually something very good and heartwarming, and that is the fact that whereas it has been species that have been contained, be that because we've been essentially we've been turning systems, we've been turning biomes that had been interconnected into islands, wherein species have been locked into ever decreasing circles of land, or within of our towns and cities, where some of our behaviours are actually inhibiting to other species, be it the extent of the noise pollution or the light pollution or the just general activity of humans. That has been reversed, wherein now it is not the species that are so much contained, but it is us. And the term I would give this is the human zoo. And that has brought about some very interesting developments, which it's somewhat difficult to actually quantify at the moment, because, of course, as with so many other facets of the online environment, there's lots of fake news. So, for example, the dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice, that has been debunked, and doubtless there will be, there's a lot of footage that is bouncing around that has no source of origin, let alone, date, place, or really anything that can actually substantiate the credibility of the footage. Now, again, there's a little bit of a sad aspect on that, in that actually to protect a lot of wildlife, you do actually need to obscure the source of the origin. So it's often important, particularly if it's a relatively rare species or a species that is vulnerable to human activity. You don't want to be too precise about quite where you saw that species and when and so forth, because obviously many species are very they're very habitual, they're very repetitive in their behavior, and so if you reveal the location and the time and so forth, you could actually be exposing the species to danger. But nonetheless, the anecdotal evidence, or not anecdotal evidence, but the anecdotal data, as it were, suggests that some really interesting things are occurring in terms of animal behavior in the built environment, in towns and cities, the interface there with, in that I have friends in the suburbs that are reporting, as have many others, that deer and other species are aggregating in greater numbers. They're being seen a little bit more often than they have for many years. So it is interesting, and the value in that will be variable, obviously, depending, first of all, on how well we quantify what has actually happened. And of course, with that, it will very much depend on people. In that, on the one hand, we're hearing a lot of individuals say, "Oh, goodness, well, being locked inside has made me realise how much I value the outdoors and how much I appreciate nature." But then the flip side of that is that human memory can actually be very short, and there is the very real possibility that, if a vaccine is developed and if treatments and so forth come into being, that effectively enable us to go back to living more or less as was, people could actually revert to precisely the same sort of behaviors, and we could not merely see the non-human life, as it were, see fauna retracting back to the places where it had effectively enclaved itself prior to the outbreak, but we could actually see a worse situation still, wherein, for example, animals that in the lockdown period, that across a period of months, have become used to populating human environments. They've been used, they've gotten used to coming into our towns or our cities, are then exposed to danger because, of course, the life cycles of these species are sometimes really very short. So with, if this lockdown or, the disruption to human or to built environments lasts, for sake of argument, 9 months, well, that is long enough for some species to have, been born, to have effectively become adult within of, their life term, and thereon to really know nothing else other than what they witnessed in the lockdown. And of course, species will adapt their behaviours to what they to the environments that they are used to. And so there are some dangers as well. But the crux of it is that, yes, this is shining a light on the worst and the best of humanity, and all the problems, but also all the possibilities of our future relationship with the natural world.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me when you were talking about that humans forget. It's from British, I think he's a journalist and a writer, Graham Hancock. He writes about ancient civilizations, that he says that
Mm,
humans is a species with amnesia. I mean, as a species, we
mm,
have amnesia. We just keep on forgetting our past,
mm,
and that's one of the reasons why we kind of go back to the same patterns. uh, Other than that, actually, you know how you mentioned that humans are now being locked, as they were somehow doing it to the other species. It's
mm,
like terraforming. You know how terraforming came
mm,
from science fiction
mm,
slowly, with Carl Sagan writing in 60s and 70s about somehow speculatively traveling in the space in some sort of a real way. And then in the sci-fi, you can see that how with the War of the World, one of the first times,
mm,
it was some other people coming. So
mm,
that imperialist colonialistic aspect of transforming, like the even in the fantasy, the urge is strong to even transform all the other planets, or the planet
mm,
they encounter, according to the human need. But
mm,
then in that story, the Martians came, and they were, of course, doing this to us.
mm. Look,
But so,
H.G. Wells,
yeah,
he was quite, Mars comes up a lot in H.G. Wells'
yeah,
writings. which is partly because, of course, at that time, astronomy was really, and studies of space in general were really starting to take off, but there were still many unknowns. And so their idea as to, and H.G. Wells' idea as to quite what could be happening on Mars was, seemingly today would seem rather ridiculous in
Mhm.
that, he and indeed many of his time thought that, there could very well be macro life on Mars as here on Earth. But actually, H.G. Wells, his work's very interesting because he effectively creates layers within his works. And so you can read in H.G. Wells' story, particularly the novellas and the longer works, on not one, but on several levels. And they were very, very much influenced by the work of Darwin and the advent of the theory of evolution. And the War of the Worlds is very much influenced by, of course, the fact that understanding the microbiology and of that which had not been seen effectively, H.G. Wells realized that this new frontier of human understanding was in recognizing that which we simply had not been aware of, or at least not formally aware of, in that, when you look back through ancient literature, you see all sorts of references to phenomena that suggests that there was, in fact, a much deeper awareness. But yes, that awareness was potentially forgotten. But the War of the Worlds is like many of H.G. Wells' books, very, very interesting to read. But in effect, the theatre, which is what he's really creating in that work, is, yes, it's set in a scientific and a virtual world, in a sort of avatar scenario wherein it is somehow deemed to be apart from the or his present world, the era in which he was writing. But in actual fact, there were a lot of references to what was going on. So the line between reality and fiction is somewhat thin, and it's obscured by the fact that, as do many writers, he was in effect cloaking ideas in fairly thinly disguised uh, form, in that he was,
Yeah.
the Martians, they, of course, that was speaking to a microbiological threat. And, that the notion of that was very much linked into the real events, and indeed to pandemics that had passed through and that he would have been aware of.
Yeah, so you, Melissa, you talks about, well, your work actually addresses a lot of what is the relationship between human systems and this highly complex Earth. So, I mean, so you're the perfect person to ask these questions, and that's, I just wanted to throw it in so that what conversation we had, it has a context to it. But you mentioned in one of your in your thesis about integrating fire. So
Mm.
I want to come back to the relationship between human systems and Earth, and what is your view on Gaia hypothesis. But I want to start from how, like, from one unit. So let's say, integrating fire. How do you see it?
Well, fire is it. To understand fire, firstly, Earth is the only planet in the solar system that has fire as such. In that, though one finds fiery phenomena on other planets, fire is, of course, a product of the burning of biomass, of basically carbon-based materials. In other words, fire cannot exist without life. The advent of fire on Earth is integral to the advent of life, in that when one traces back the evolution of life on Earth, one finds that fire came into that story very early on. And, essentially, I mean, when we look back through the ages, of course, we have a pretty accurate record of the way in which fire has manifested, both in terms of its geographic spread across the continents and across, and in terms of its intensity. So the reason for that is that fire is recorded in the fossil record, in that, we have this particular class of fossil, which is the fusane record, and it's charcoal to all intents and purposes, the charcoal record. And so we know that the relationship between fire and plant life is one of coevolution. It is one of coexistence. And to the extent that some species, and indeed many extant species, many of the species that remain here today, they don't just live with fire, but their reproductive processes are wholly dependent on fire. And that quality, that feature, that functional trait within their behavior, it stems right back to the origin of that species. And interestingly, though obviously, the fundamental theory of evolution is that species adapt, and therefore the species that are living today are, have to an extent adapted to what in effect are lower intensities, lower typical intensities and frequencies of fire than at some previous points in the record of life on Earth and in the history of life on Earth. So, for example, if we go back to the Carboniferous period, the gaseous composition of the atmosphere was different in that there was more oxygen, which in turn made the probability of combustion higher. And with that, there was a lot of plant matter. There was a lot of fuel, to use the term that you would in the fire sciences. And fires were raging, and they were raging at intensities and at scales that it would be actually quite difficult for us to picture today. And to give an idea of the extent to which they were raging, whereas today we think of a blue sky, and we're used to blue skies because essentially the particulates in our atmosphere are, we have less particulate matter in our atmosphere, and so effectively we have a clearer atmosphere. In the Carboniferous period, we would not have seen blue skies. We would have seen skies that were they were tinged with reds, with oranges, and with other colours, which were obviously a consequence of the fact that light was refracting off all these many particulate, all the many particles in the atmosphere from these constantly burning, raging fires. And so, fire is very much, it is one of the, along with water, this is not just the blue planet, it is the fiery planet. And that fundamental facet is not very well understood within many communities, that it's become somewhat lost. Now, I say within many communities because there was an ancient time when fire was very well understood by humans and indeed by our closest cousins, and not, backed by one, as it were, evolutionary generation, one other species of human, but of a number. And again, this is not hypothesis. This is evidenced by both anthropological and archaeological and indeed biological data. In that, this is actually written into our DNA. We have certain adaptations as a species that are not found in even our closest relatives within the chimpanzees. And fire is so fundamental to our development as a species that were it not for fire, and more specifically for our control of fire, this being something that, as I said, it dates back throughout not merely the entirety of the human lineage, but prior to that, we would not exist. And when I say we would not exist, our lineage would not exist. So we wouldn't be here. But fire, over the epochs, over the ages of human civilization, has become increasingly invisible in the minds of the many. And of course, part of that is to do with the fact, or indeed a large part of that is to do with the fact that in many cultures, and particularly the West, fire, though it undermines our society and every facet of it, and that obviously we are an industrialized, we are a species that is reliant on technology, and that is reliant on all of the processes that fire facilitates. So, for example, obviously, fire facilitates chemistry, fire facilitates the extraction and the modification of many materials. We would not be speaking now were it not for those many processes enabling the creation of the technology of the laptops and of the servers and of all the other things to enabling us to speak right now. We would not have this without fire. But fire is, as I said, is a very misunderstood phenomena. It is a very demonized phenomena. And in environments, many have in effect forgotten fire's role. And so theirs is not the awareness that there are species that are adapted to fire, species that would go extinct in its absence. Theirs is not the awareness that with regard to our management of fire, we do have options. We do have different ways in which we can work with fire. But at the end of the day, I was speaking to the Carboniferous, I was speaking to there being previous periods in which fire's behavior was in many ways much more dangerous than it is today. I mean, yes, we have big wildfire events, but, the point that I'm making here is that, yes, we have a certain degree of control over fire, but that the extent of that control is limited. And it is essentially limited, obviously, yes, to the gaseous composition of the atmosphere, although that, in the scheme of things, isn't going to change anytime soon. It is also very much impacted by temperature and by humidity, which, needless to say, at a time of climate change are changing. And that is a major contributing factor to, obviously, the fact that wildfires are now becoming more prevalent and they are becoming more frequent in some areas. And in other areas, they are not merely becoming more frequent, they're becoming more intense. So the manifestation of fire on Earth is changing. We have a very big part to play in that, and then there are all sorts of things that we are doing. And I've discussed them in detail in the thesis, but there are all sorts of things that we are doing that are yet further disrupting what are technically the current fire regime. So the typical behaviours of fire in the environment that have been prevalent within the Holocene, they are now shifting. And so really the thesis at its heart is drawing attention to the fact that there is this legacy and that, fire is fundamental to not merely our own existence, but to that of all life on Earth, or all terrestrial, not terrestrial life, all land life on Earth, rather. And that we have choices to make, we have decisions to make, and how and why we make them will obviously be very much a product of our understanding of the world about us. And that, of course, comes down to many, many factors, but amongst others, it comes down to our understanding of how and why we think the way that we do. And so another major facet of the thesis is looking to how other peoples think about fire, and not just ancient peoples from across many different cultures, but of course indigenous peoples. And when we looked at their understanding of the phenomena of fire on Earth, obviously, I mean, indigenous peoples like non-indigenous peoples have various different ideas, and they're not. One can't, strictly speaking, assume that they're all in line, as it were, with one particular ideology. But nonetheless, we find there is in an inherent understanding that fire is to be understood as an integral part of life on Earth, and that requires us to have a degree of humility in our actions in regard of its presence.
Yeah, I mean, just the image of having orange red skies and O3 maybe in the atmosphere, and strong fires is just, for humans, for our day-to-day existence, we just don't have enough capacity, and not that we have evolved to think on these huge timelines. So yeah, it's just easier for us probably to push that away and just worry about what's going on. But what I realized, I mean, the myth of stealing fire, Prometheus, it is so interesting that that myth of Prometheus and, the gods. I mean, we
Mm.
started from fire, and now, we are probably are becoming, those gods which we were dreaming, in a way that now we actually want to terraform the earth itself. So it's funny that the word is terraforming, but it's now projecting it back. So, geoengineering has been talked about. And we are now coming out of the earth, and the fire was maybe the first thing, as you were mentioning, which is so crucial. The first piece of technology, if you want to call it. And now where we are, probably, it's technical hubris of our species, mostly because we always think that yeah, that's the technology which will, transcend us to the godhood. And but always what happened in the end is that we just then deal with the problem which has been created by the technology, and then create something else. So probably geoengineering would be another thing which would just destroy the core, possibly, because any historian, any design scientist, someone who understand a bit of complex system, generally they are not that positive about
No,
our understanding. Yeah, please.
no. Um, yeah, I mean, I've spoken about the I guess you could call it the arrogance of some to assume that we are the gods now, because the idea that I mean, to look at where that comes from, there was and actually in the movie Prometheus, and it was by no means incidental. There was a line, obviously, so say delivered by the sort of Elon Musk, as it were, of the movie, this tech guru of whom the corporation enabled the exploration that the film revolves around. Um, he said, we are the gods now. We aren't the gods now. What we are is a species that, having evolved from fire, and actually within a period that was actually extremely geologically and climatically stable, the Holocene, that being a period when, yes, we had a few V7 eruptions, and at some periods when we had a flutter, as it were, of V6 eruptions, of which the consequence was volcanic winters, amongst other things, that pushed our species to the limit. But we haven't really, had much in the way of, as it were, environmental hardship as such, or at least not in a sustained context. In that, when major environmental events have happened, they have either been quite brief, and when I say brief, I'm speaking to a period of decades or at most a few hundred years, as opposed to a geological epoch. And they have generally been quite patchy in their expression, in that there have been various places that for one or another reason have been rather less exposed than have others. This is a very different ballgame that we find ourselves in now, in that the scale of the climatic transition, if we're to look at the best and the worst case scenarios, we are looking at a scenario that, from a geological perspective, is taking us out of the stability of the Holocene, and it is taking us into a period in which events that really push our species to its limits are becoming much more frequent, much more severe. And of course, simultaneously to that, we as a species are many times more populous. And the upshot of that is that whereas in times ancient past, we were nomadic, principally we were nomadic because, we've obviously only been settling for a mere 10,000 years. So within and of our history as a species, it's really a brief window of time that we have been, engaged in this thing called civilization. And now we're at a point at which we've built all of these settlements, of which a very many are going to be, and they're right in the firing line of major environmental events. And of course, the thing about these events, and this is really sort of pointing to some of the truths, as it were, in some of the ancient mythologies. We all know of the plagues of Egypt, and we all know of the narratives that essentially suggest that, one event was followed by another, and it all came back to human sin. Now, I'm not a religious person, but what I will say is that there are some truths within and of these ancient myths. And the reason for that, or the reason that they're speaking to truths, is that there are indeed correlations between certain classes of environmental events. So, for example, if you look back at the history of plagues, particularly the bubonic plague, it becomes very much evident that there are correlations with shifts in climate. And of course, the reason for that is it's actually very logical. It is because as and when the likes of droughts are created, it displaces species, which in turn displaces the pathogens that those species carry. And when those species come into contact with humans, out breaks a pandemic, which of course are worsened in a drought or in a period of environmental crisis, because of course we as a species are more vulnerable in that when we are physiologically we are starved, as it were, if we're in a famine, or if, for any reason our immune system is suppressed, then we are more likely to succumb to the pandemic. So we tend to see couplings of environmental crises, pandemics, and all sorts of other things. It doesn't rain, but it pours. And we're now in an era in which, these things are all converging, they're all coming to a head. Fire is right at the heart of that, in that, as we speak, there are not thousands of now dead, tinder dry, ready to combust trees out there. There are tens of millions. And this has been known for some time. And this is why, for example, the extreme fires in California of the last few years were anticipated. They weren't a surprise event, not to the fire science community. It was there, it was written, it was very clear in the data. We are going to get extreme fires. And what the data is now saying, we are going to get more extreme fires. And the fires are not going to be contained just to California. They're going to be breaking out elsewhere. But of course, as I said, it never rains, but it pours, because the fires in of themselves, they then burn off the biomass, which in turn increases the probability of flooding and of debris falls and of various other geological failings. And so, we have that going on. Then, of course, we have the fact that the Greenland and the Antarctic, the polar ice caps are melting at a faster rate than some had anticipated. I say some because, again, in the worst case trajectories, the rates that we're now seeing were there. They were forecast within those trajectories. And so sea levels are rising. And, this is all going on. And this is the big wake-up call. This is the thing that says, you know what? Humans, you have so much capacity, but you are not the gods of this planet. There are forces that are innumerably bigger than are you. And actually, it's all relative, because, of course, if we were to sort of step back from planet Earth and we were to step out into the universe, we find there are yet bigger events. Of which one, of course, would be a solar storm. How many individuals have pondered the fact that at any point, and we would have relatively little notice. We might, goodness me, have at most 24 hours, if that, notice of a major solar storm event, which, if it struck at the precisely right time, we'd be incredibly unfortunate for this to happen, but if it struck at just the right time, when the planet is in a particular orbit to the sun, at a particular proximity, on a particular axis, and in a particular season, then you might not be looking at, what we've seen in the past, wherein, for example, in Quebec, there was a solar storm that knocked out a number of the communications because, of course, it created, amongst other things, electrical surges. You could see half the planet, or possibly even more, have their entire electrical structure, their internet, their comms, their utilities, bang, knocked out.
Yeah.
And, of course, with that, you could simultaneously have firestorms, because what happens when you have electrical surges on power cables? Well, you get sparks. What happens when sparks hit in dry season? You get fires. So, these are the realities, in that we don't know how bad things might get, but we certainly know that things are getting a lot more challenging than they have been.
True.
And so now is the time that we fundamentally, as a species, have a choice. We either accept we're not the gods, and these are the things that we actually need to confront, or, we try and build big walls, and we try and kid ourselves that, we can we can insulate ourselves from forces that are immeasurably greater than our we.
Yeah, I mean, this one freaks me out the most, the solar flare, definitely. And this is not even something which could, like, it has happened 60 million years ago or something. This thing has happened 100 years ago, and it's a very, as you said, it's a blip. Like 10,000 years is a blip, and even 500 years is literally just a blip since maybe industrial revolution. And yeah,
Mm,
the prospect of solar flare and all of our communication, all of our data in the cloud, hypothetically,
mm.
and electronic grid. I just don't understand that. I don't understand at this point, to be very honest, that if we are just keep on going and keep on reproducing and keep on consuming, I mean, where, and without actually realizing and paying respect to the place we are and the power, as you said, exists, like outside of just our tiny echoey egos. I mean, where do you think it would lead? I mean, is there any other place than just driving us off the cliff? If there is, I mean, it would be great to find out. But just a very simple introspection would
Well, I
reveal
think
that.
what I'm seeing at the moment is actually, again, I mean, history does repeat itself. It really, we like to imagine that ours is the capacity to build utopia, to build afresh. That's an ongoing narrative in human culture. But when you look back, you find that the same patterns, the same scenarios, they manifest time and again. And we see it right now. And that before I was speaking about the fact that the pandemic has brought out both the absolute best and the absolute worst in many people. And in that sense, we're seeing a bifurcation of society. Now, this isn't just happening ethically and morally in terms of the way in which people choose to respond, in that some people are saying, well, mine is the responsibility to help my fellow man as much as I can, and obviously, as and where they can, to help the environment. At the other end of the spectrum, we have those people that are completely out for themselves and that have absolutely no concern for their fellow man. And then we have people that are kind of in between. But actually, in business, when you look at what's happening in the business world right now, in response to the pandemic, we have they that have acknowledged that if they want to basically ensure that they're going to have a business 24 months from now, they need to reevaluate what are the new risks, what are the new opportunities, and what is my capacity, what is my business's capacity to adapt to this. And on the one hand, we're seeing people that are being very proactive and they are essentially developing new facets to their business in order that they adapt to this new scenario, while also retaining the flexibility so that, whichever way this swings at the end of it, they've got a bit of leeway. At the other end of the spectrum, we find they of whom it is the assumption that this situation will come to a close within a controllable period. It will be not the circumstances that will set the agenda, but it will be us. We will be able to say, well, in the fashion of Trump, we'll have shut this down by X date, we'll have shut this down by Christmas or whenever it might be. And that after that, there's just the assumption they can just go back. They can just go back to how things were. And so, be it in business or personally, we all have a choice. We can all either accept, well, there are things that are shifting now, and we can take it upon ourselves to look at that shift and to see how we might adapt, or we can be belligerent and we can say, nope, I'm not going to accept change, and I'm just going to stick here in the mud. I'm just going to carry on doing what I was doing. And so I think it's a mixed picture. And although I'm using the analogy of, business persons or individuals, this is happening at a global scale. On the one hand, we have nations that are, doing their best to try and adapt to the circumstance. We have the opposite, and it's a very, very mixed picture. And so my concern now is, well, it's firstly, which of these two which of these two narratives is going to win out, because ultimately we're in a tug of war, and I'm not absolutely sure, who is going to win that war right now.
Yeah.
And also the fact that we don't know what's going to come up behind this. We can only speculate, and we could get lucky. I mean, it could be that, hey, 12 months from now, we're out of the pandemic, we've got a vaccine, it's been developed, it's been deployed, and we're all, rolling along with ease. Or on the other hand, to again look at the complexity of Earth systems, the fact that there are lower emissions, of course, means that there are, amongst other things, fewer clouds and fewer aeroplane trails and so forth. And that in turn has affected the atmosphere. And one of the things, again, I read actually last week was that we're now seeing meteorologists and climatologists in turn warn that the probability of flooding will be higher this year. And so now we've got to think about, well, what's going to happen if not only are we dealing with a pandemic, but we're dealing with higher than average flooding in this year. And it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly messy. And so that is why I'm not pessimistic, but I very much walk straight down the line, in that I don't allow myself to get too optimistic. I don't allow myself to get too down in the mouth. I just look at all this stuff going on and think, well, how are we going to try and walk the middle line here and expose ourselves not to the bias, which is so easy when you shut down your blinkers and you're not looking at the full picture.
Yeah, I mean, probably maybe loss of human story. I mean, I don't see any human story right now. There's just, as you can see, physical and also, mental factions exist, and technocrat, highly rational, and the science which is turning a bit towards, again, this ideological, religious, omnipotent kind of solution providers. I mean, of course, all of us and the different characters should have a seat on the table, but shouldn't. I mean, it looks like that they are the only ones at this point who have the seat on the table, and we maybe it's another, just a side effect of, you can say, divorcing ourselves from older myths and the confusions, and we actually maybe divorced some part of that self which connects us to our own story, and also to the capacity we have, and how dangerous we can be. And by looking at it, we can actually understand that what acts can impact and connects us to the nature. And again, of course, I'm not talking from a religious point of view, but again, these limiting modalities where you can't talk about self and soul or whatever the vocabulary is, it's again damaging in a way that, as a human, you just don't know at this point, as a storyteller, or how our language has developed, that who really we are. I mean, just tons of social overwhelm, anxiety for general people, where they just compare yourself with 7 billion people all the time, try to have these echo chambers, and that's just the dominant narrative, rather than aligning ourselves with our environment and the forces and accepting it. That, I mean, or letting go. Maybe this epidemic, you see, like, there's an epidemic of control also, around
I think, I mean, I think things are very tribal.
yeah.
We split back into tribes, which is quite interesting, because if you look to our origin, I mean, and if you look to indigenous communities of whom the relations with the wider world are in effect severed. So if you were to look at some of the more remote tribes of, for example, the Amazon, you actually find there's a very coherent sense of identity. And they're, generally speaking, although they are typically sort of a la colonialism, portrayed as having a very simplistic view of life. If you look to the mythologies and if you look to the belief systems of these indigenous peoples, they're actually very sophisticated. They're highly layered. They exhibit a profound understanding of the systemic nature of life. Structurally, they all have, well, certainly all they that I have studied have correlations. There are, certain narratives that come up time and again, such, for example, as the idea that in the possession of knowledge, the acquisition not only of the control of fire, but of knowledge more generally, there comes a price, and it's a price that is eternal, and it is a price that is great. And in that sense, the myths, and of course many world religions, their attempt essentially is to imbue a sense of responsibility, a sense of the responsibility that comes with knowledge. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have societies that are they are very diversified, they are very big typically, and they have fractured. And it does seem they are fracturing yet more, in that not merely is it the case that we have polarized societies now, but within and of those polarized societies, we have even more fracturing. So, for example, if we looked at the sustainability community, on the one hand, we have they that believe that, yes, we should, and this is my belief, as it were, this is my way of operating, that think it imperative that we have everyone at the table and we listen to everybody and we try to understand everybody's perspective and we try and find the correlations, we try and find the areas of contention, and we try and navigate a compromise. And in that sense, we recognize that there is inherent logic in the views of everyone, because even they, that are actually typically portrayed as being anti-environment, and they have an inherent logic. There's a reason why they think the way they do. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we have what is actually a very bourgeoisie perspective, and that we have they that imagine that there are, as it were, the truth keepers, and that those individuals ought dictate what everyone else should do. And it tends to be a very dogmatic approach. So it tends to be all about you shouldn't. So you shouldn't fly, and you shouldn't own a car, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do that. And that in itself it's a very insular approach, in that it tends not to actually accept that, these issues are very complex. I mean, it's a very complex issue as to whether or not there is a rationale to fly or not. I would argue that if it's for a trivial purpose, or if you're flying a lot, then you should re-examine your travel. I'd argue there is actually a rationale for that. But then again, if we all stop flying, there are profound and awful repercussions from that, be it that, many loved ones would not get to see one another, cultures would become yet more insulated, yet more cut off, critical supplies for science and medicine and so forth would not be able to reach their destination in the time required in order for certain experiments and medical procedures and so forth to occur. So these things are really very complex, but the sustainability community in and of itself, they're often portrayed as being a unit, as being a solid, delineated group of people, is incredibly fractured. And that same story is now manifest across many facets of society, and it's causing problems. And as you say, we have no common story as a species right now. I mean, ironically, you could argue, if you actually expand the timeline, and if you look at us from an anthropological perspective over, not mere years or tens of years or centuries, but over epochs, then yes, we absolutely have a story. But right now, there is a loss of story, and that is playing out in many different ways. And what it means is that there is, there's a lack or a confusion over identity. There are disputes over who it is that we are, what it is that we should be doing. And I think the question of reconciling that is incredibly difficult, because, of course, the concept of the internet, the reason that many were so eager to create the internet and to develop this global net, this global communication platform, was because the idea was, it would make the world smaller, and it would enable us to communicate with our fellow man and to exchange information en masse that supposedly would bring us together. It would supposedly make us more united. But actually, when we look at the world today and across the journey of, the period since the advent of going online, of the birth of the World Wide Web, that is not true. In that, what has instead happened is that we've reconfigured, wherein we're still every bit as tribal as we once were, but we've just slightly moved, the parameters of how those tribes are formed. So instead of necessarily being tribal within and of our geographic space, i.e. the people that we're meeting or we would have been meeting day to day, we're now tribal with groups that we've met online or in some other digitally facilitated context. And it is an incredible mess. There are some incredibly unfortunate things coming from it. And, I think it is an extremely important area to research and to try to gain understanding on. But, from my perspective, I really don't have much of an idea, to be honest, as to how the dickens we actually do reconcile it, because as is, I think we're in a very bleak place.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So, I mean, this actually, what you're talking about environmentalism, that how there's a bit of a separation in this movement where there's a purity of you know staying with the local solutions and minimum technology, but then there's some of the people who are maybe leading at some point, they're like, well, you know what, it's coming, we can't really resist it, so probably be part of it, and soften the edges of this issue. And they're saying, okay, yes, even relying on these big corporations, without the technology the type of technology which could be used to save probably the environment, requires a level of this hungry unlimited growth metropolis places. So there's this conflict, and then overall we as a human and our relationship with the environment, we have an issue of, at first, separation, which is just
Mm.
like everywhere, and then we are now trying at some point also reconcile ourselves with these ideas like animism, but more not more like fairy tale, but more evolved, maybe trying to be a bit more grounded, that it's not about us and it's nothing to do with anthropocentralism. But the problem still, at another level on the top of it, even though we are trying it, it's still, we do have the technology, and it kind of makes us a bit powerful, a bit omnious at points. So there's like a lot of issues going on, and on the top of each other. And I don't know, what is it, our urge to understand complex system and then control it still? I mean,
Well, I think, if there is a positive, often when I don't have an answer, the first place I look is to history usually. And if we look back through the history of the recorded history of humanity, what we know from that, and particularly this past several hundred years, is that we go through periods when, I mean, there's always a wrestle. There's always a wrestle between what is essentially the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, either haves and the have-nots. And that, well, I mean, it's certainly a problem that goes back as far as the written record. Although there are, if we look to the Bronze Age, there were certain peoples that, if you like, had a more equitable society than we do today, in that they were better able to distribute wealth in a way that was fair. That said, that was typically happening when resources were abundant and the environment was in quite a stable, relatively stable state. However, again, if we look to the East, again, the history of China, there were periods when China was relatively um, peaceful and collaborative with its, both within and of itself and with its immediate neighbors. And then there were, in contrast to that, there were periods of warfare. And essentially, there's been this sort of bouncing to and fro when, we go through periods when we're getting along rather better, and then we go through periods when we're not. But I think if there is a glimmer of hope in the current situation, it's that if we were to look back to perhaps the closest proxy we have to now, which might perhaps be the 1300s or the 1600s, when Britain, and indeed around the world, but I'm focusing on Britain because that's the period historically that I tend to pay a bit more attention to with regard to this issue. Um, there was extreme inequality, and there was a lot of conflict, particularly, for example, if we look at the early 1600s. We had essentially gone through a period in which, of course, having the discovery of America and, if you like, the age of adventure, when Portugal and Spain and Britain and France and so forth were going out around the world. They were claiming territories. They were claiming the assets of peoples over which really technically, I mean, ethically, they had no right, but they obviously inflicted themselves on these other places, and they took their assets. They used that money, if there was a silver lining, they used that money to fuel the Renaissance and to fuel the golden age, as it were. And then after, having done that, the 1600s came along, and a period of great environmental hardship, extremes of heat, hot weather, of droughts against extreme cold events, and of course with that the pandemics and so forth. And history, the history makes apparent that society started to become more fragmented. British society was yet further diverging. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of resentment, and of course the Civil War occurred. The King Charles came to an end, and we tried to restructure. Britain tried to restructure, and to what extent it did, because of course, having then revolted, we then re-embraced the inherent hierarchy. We embraced monarchy once more. But there was nonetheless this breaking point at which society, or rather they that had been disenfranchised, said, enough is enough. And we are going to use whatsoever means that are at our disposal to build a more equitable society, and to challenge that, which is unfair. And I think that is happening now, although it's happening in a way that is less clear to delineate than back in those times, because of course we have got a more complex society. We are living in a world, I mean, to an extent that was a globalized time, and that we were traveling all over the world. We were bringing in goods and supplies from all over the planet. And so it was in effect a globalized era then, but it's more so now. I mean, on the surface of it can be quite hard to sort of decipher what's going on. But I do think there is a bit of an uprising, and I do think that, as in the 1600s and back in the 1300s, it is coming in waves. It's not a one-off event; it's a series of events. And I think probably about maybe 70 years from now, we'll be able to obviously we'll probably be gone by then, but people will be able to look back and they'll be able to unravel what was going on and say, well, yes, we'd reached the tipping point and the system was set to reconfigure, and through a variety of process it did, and these are some of the positives that came out from that. And so I guess my view is that there are challenges, but there are signs that within and of that there are probably some much needed reconfigurations that are going to occur. But of course, in and of themselves, they're difficult processes, and they invariably involve some fractions of the community suffering, or being exposed to a greater level of threat and discomfort than is desirable.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, as there are in our personal life, there are moments where you can face the challenge as a species. Hopefully we can face the challenge and transcend, and I'm sure maybe there are some ways how life is tested, and either we perish or we transcend and be able to connect to our deeper wisdom. But okay, now a little bit of a different topic. So you wrote about a fragment of our prophilic past, if I'm pronouncing it
Mm.
correct. I mean, what is this? Yeah, I want to
Pyrophilic. It's a word I've actually
pyrophilic.
coined. So it's
Okay.
that word pyrophilic is essentially, you'll know of biophilia and you'll
Yeah.
know of biophilic. So
Yeah.
biophilic is obviously relating to that which is embracing of nature or of a concept of nature. So pyrophilia is a word I've coined to essentially convey an acceptance of fire as a fundamental and integral aspect of the functioning of life on earth, of our world.
Okay. So, but this is this the story which you were writing about the palm tree in Australia? I mean, I actually want to know about it. Is this the same thing I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, well that's actually relating to myths. It wasn't me that was writing about the palm tree. It was David Bowman, who was one of the foremost fire ecologists on earth. So he I can't even remember how many papers he's authored. It's something like, it's in excess of over 550 papers, books, and other publications. He
Wow.
is the oracle on fire ecology.
Wow.
And one of an interesting paper that he published with some peers a couple of years ago interrogated the possibility that an Aboriginal tale of how the only native palm in Australia came to be in a certain place. And what they did is they decrypted, in effect, the mythological tale through the lens of fire ecology. Now, that is a general approach to mythology that has been building an interest of the past, well, it's now a couple of decades, wherein there are whole research teams that are, for example, looking for correlations between mythological accounts of geological and other environmental events and reality. And that actually has uses both from the perspective of understanding how ancient peoples perceived of their world, but also in terms of trying to date the origin of mythological tales. And therefore, there's an inherent anthropological and wider research value to attempting to decrypt, is there a correlation? That is something that I picked up on and that I followed through in the thesis, and that I interrogated the origin of fire myths. And my theory, in fact, or my hypothesis, because it's not proven, and indeed it's such a complex field that is dealing with such ancient data, as it were, that it may never be proven. But my hypothesis is that the origin of fire myth is born of real world observation. And the reason for this is that when we look to the fire myths about the world, of which there are very many in different cultures, we find that, like language, they have, for example, like the Indo-European language, they have common structures, they have commonalities in their narrative, they have common characteristics in terms of the attributes that are affiliated to key characters, to key components of these myths. And with relation to their discussions on fire, certainly with respect to, you mentioned Prometheus. Now, of course, Prometheus was said to have stolen fire from and knowledge of fire from Athena and Hephaestus, and of course the other character in that trio was Zeus, the if you like, the king, the god of the gods. And looking at that myth and tracing it back through to pre-Socratic times, both the poetry of Sappho and the Athenians and the earlier groups that essentially explored and authored mythologies around that particular tale. There are similarities with the origin of fire myths of other cultures in India, in South America, and so forth. And because of the fact, we know that these tales are very ancient, as I said, structurally, these myths, and narratively and in terms of meaning, these have commonalities, which, if we were to apply the same principles as etymology, i.e., how and why language evolved as it did, we'd be looking at a common origin. We would be looking, in order for there to be these similarities in structure and meaning and so forth, we'd be looking at a point of common origin, which if we are to trace our known or the known movements of humans as they spread out around the world and as these cultures formed, and obviously we know a fair amount about the origins or the date, as it were, of arrival of certain peoples in certain parts of the world, suggests that these origin of fire myths have a common source, or they have one of a limited number of common sources that predate the migration of these peoples and the evolution of their cultures. Because, of course, in that process, as with language, there are modifications that are made. So, for example, one of the things I've identified is that though, for example, different species are referred to, or, obviously different names and different incarnations of objects of which the purpose is the same, for example, a torch or a fennel stick, but the incarnation, if you like, is modified to be bespoke to that culture, i.e. to the sort of tools or names or sort of things that had evolved within that particular community over time. And if that is true, as in the case, if there is truth in this hypothesis, as with Bowman's hypothesis, or indeed it's now proven as theory, that the origin of the palm tree, the native Australian palm tree, does in fact correlate with the Aboriginal myth story, then that has profound implications, because what that is saying is that these mythologies, they are more than just tall tales. They are in effect what you might think of as a system of communication, which, a little like a scientific paper today, is structured in such a way that it's conveying important knowledge, it's conveying information that is fundamental to these persons, these communities, understanding of the world. And certainly, again, in order that we to add another layer of understanding to where I'm heading with this, different cultures, obviously, they not merely adapt their language, so the actual wording that they use, and I've spoken a bit to the etymology actually in the thesis discussion, but of course they also use symbolism. They use symbolism in terms of iconography. They use symbolism in terms of numerology. And if we look at it on that level, not just in terms of the narrative and the meaning and so forth, but we find that there are structures, there are symbols that are coming up time and time and time again. And so in that context, mythology itself has an evolutionary story that, if understood, enables us to understand how human culture and how human belief systems actually evolved. And with that, I mean, if we were to bring in a couple of the other theorists on this, I've spoken at length about the work of a chap called Terence Turner. Now, Terence Turner will be known amongst they that are very attuned to Indigenous rights, to human rights, and to the efforts to protect Indigenous communities and their interests around the world, because he essentially was extremely active in that regard for many years and undertook some very notable works. But Terence Turner was actually an anthropologist that essentially carried on the work of Levi Strauss, and actually within of the same region in the Amazon forest. And he added another layer to Strauss's work, in that whereas Strauss had only really looked at the structure of mythology, Terence Turner actually really got into the meaning. And so he took, as it were, the vessel of understanding that a little bit forward. He actually spent a number of decades in the Amazonian forests with particular communities to decrypt their mythologies. And in his work, essentially what he's done, and this again is a point that I've picked up on and discussed, he essentially emphasized how, I mean, not in so many words, but he essentially spoke to the fact that understanding of mythology until relatively recently was very much tainted by colonialism and by the elitist global north narrative, the idea that other peoples are primitive, other peoples are savage, to use the Levi Straussian term. And Turner's work really his book came out. It's well worth the read. It came out just a couple of years ago. I actually I edited it in latterly into the thesis, actually, because originally the book had come out so very, very recently to when it essentially went to print pretty much at the time I was submitting. So I hadn't really had time to craft that discussion with any depth. So I actually, that was one of the edits I made. I actually bumped in Turner latterly before the final submission. But he built on this theme, and I too have spoken to the fact that when we think to mythology, when we think also to myths, to legends, and to really all forms of communication, of knowledge of other peoples, of indigenous peoples, and of ancient peoples, we really need to be aware of our prejudices. We really need to be aware that actually, just because we don't understand the way in which these narratives are structured, just because the symbolism is alien to us, just because the relations that these mythologies have to others, and that when you look to the mythologies of the ancient world and indeed of extant indigenous peoples, the mythologies, they're not standalone. You can think of them almost like a soap opera, in that they are related to an ongoing narrative. In order to really understand one mythology, you need to read, and you need to know the narratives of they that relate to it. And of course, the bigger that matrix of mythologies that you then understand, and in turn the better your understanding of the characters and the symbols within and of those mythologies, the better your understanding of the language that is in use, and the better your understanding of the meaning. And that, I think, is really important. And some people may, wonder, well, why on earth would someone that was really trying to challenge the contemporary approach to fire, the idea that we need to control it, we need to eradicate it, we need to remove it from as much of our wild landscapes and so forth as possible, the common sort of narrative of the popular media. Why would one dig into these ancient mythologies? Why would one dig into the indigenous beliefs? And the reason is very simple. If we don't understand how other people understand fire, if we don't actually recognize how our own ideologies differentiate from others, and over time, then ours is a very limited understanding of how and why we came to be where we are. In that, we have to compare, we have to see where the differentials are in order to really get to the roots of how we arrived at the place that we're at. And so, it's a piece within a piece, and I don't know quite, where I will take the mythologies discussion, but certainly in terms of how much there is to research, I've since reviewed my own work. In fact, I've been back through my own thesis, and I've written various notes and observed things that I actually hadn't observed in the original authorship. And so I've already built it out. And, I would hope that there are others. I know certainly, as I said, Bowman has already looked at this. But I would hope that about the world, there are many others that are really starting to cotton on to the fact that, there is this rich information, there is this structured information, there is this complexity narrative that is very much clear in these mythologies and in the belief systems to which they relate, that have, in effect, been hidden to the greater part of the Western world, to the global north, for a not insignificant amount of time, because we simply hadn't looked. We simply hadn't asked the question, well, could it be that actually, the use, for example, of certain species, such as the pine, references to pine cones or to oaks or to other, I'm speaking to fire adapted species, could it be that their use is not incidental, that this is not, a mere accident, that they have chosen to reference these particular species in a particular way, and instead be the fact that these peoples really understood their landscape, they really understood these species, they understood the interplay between fire and and the natural world, they understood the symbiosis, and they conveyed it in these rich tapestries of mythologies and other narratives that are all there and all along just waiting for us to take a look, and in doing so, to, as I said, to understand ourselves better, but also to understand them better, to understand our ancestors better, and to understand the other peoples with whom we share the planet better.
Beautiful. I 100%. I couldn't agree more to what you are saying. Well, I'm aware of the time. Is there anything else you want to add? As in, what are you doing now? And if people maybe want to look at some of the other work or media, are there any specific places?
Yeah, well, I decided I'd actually build a website for the thesis. The reason being that I wanted to make it as accessible as possible. And so, although it will be bumped into the same old usual suspects, the research gates and the academia and so forth,
Hmm.
um, I've built its own standalone site. On there is the text. I haven't actually added in the images yet, which is principally a download issue. It's because obviously the more the more I build out the site with imagery and so forth, the potentially slower the download is, and I don't want to be creating a cumbersome site. So it's just the text at the moment, but it's all there. And you can find that if you go to Panarchic Codex. The site will also it's got an ongoing interview series that I've started, which is to further build out some of the conversations that I started in the thesis, as well as to bring awareness to some of the characters who I've discussed in their work. Because, as I said, I referenced Bowman, but there are many others who are um, their works are extraordinary and fascinating, and I really would hope that a very many beyond the fire sciences and fire ecology community would start to read them, because I think there's immense value to be found there. There will also be a podcast series that's starting next month, which essentially I'm migrating the thesis into audio, and that is again to make it yet more accessible. They that are hard of sight, or that are reliant on audio media alone. And there will be updates on the work. Unfortunately, obviously, because of the lockdown, any field research or indeed even lab research at the moment it too is on lockdown, because can't physically get out there and do it. So the emphasis is very much on publishing, but it's all there. And there's also the social media has just started going, so that's just starting to roll for anyone that is interested. And I hope that a lot of the work, it is highly speculative, and it is working with ideas that are very novel. But of course, one of the primary um, underlying reasons for that is because I want to provoke. I want to bring people's attention to possibilities that either weren't on the radar or were ignored for one or another reason. And more generally, what I've been doing is I've been working transdisciplinary. So you'll have heard in that conversation I was jumping between different subjects. What I would say today that are working in this space is, when you're thinking to not merely how you structure your work, and it's quite a task to work transdisciplinary, because of course you've got to, well, invariably you've got to have a wider literary and general awareness of your domain, because you're working with not one, but you're working with many subjects. But also, one of the big challenges, I think, not merely for researchers in the particular areas that I'm working, but more generally in the transdisciplinary space, is that it is quite difficult to find places that really hit the sweet spot um, for reaching the audiences that you want to reach. In that, yes, you have lots of journals that are dedicated to this or to that discipline, and within of the academic world, they tend to be quite narrow in their content, the discussions, and actually within of their audiences. And of course, in theory, you could write 1,000,001 papers that goes into 1,000,001 journals, and populate all of them. But actually, we all have time limitations, and so another of the reasons that I actually built a site to host this work was because I was aware that at the moment there actually wasn't that sweet spot. There wasn't somewhere that really hit the nail on the head of where I was looking to take this research. And so I thought, you know what, I'll build an open access site. We'll see how it goes. And actually, I've had a pretty good response. But yeah, feedback would be good. You know, if folks jump on and they you know, find something that's particularly interesting, or if there's something that, you know, is a bit niggly, then yeah, let me know. As I said, the image with the issue with the images is one of, it's one of download speeds, and I might be able to mitigate that through some other fashion. But yeah, feedback would be great, and I hope that anyone who does take the time to drop by at least finds it interesting, even if they don't agree with all of the points that are made.
I will put all the links for sure underneath the podcast. Melissa, thank you so much. I mean, this definitely was one of the best hours I've had for last week. So thanks a lot for the conversation.
Oh, it's been a pleasure as always.
Same. Thank you.
Take care. Bye for now.
Bye, people.